Today I will be demonstrating water etching to create a surface texture on ceramics. To create a water etched piece, you will need a bone dry piece of clay, wax resist, and a variety of brushes. I prefer to use synthetic brushes, preferably brushes with flexible bristles, as opposed to some synthetic brushes with rigid bristles. The wax spreads evenly on the piece and the brushes are easier to clean. I've sketched out a piece first in my sketchbook. I do this so that I can have an idea of which part of the designs will be raised and which will be recessed. You can begin to paint directly on the bone dry piece with your brush, or if you prefer, you can sketch out your idea and then paint over it with wax. This piece I've just outlined the border with pencil, and then for the rest of the piece I'll just do it freehand without having the drawing on the clay. The design one chooses can be representational or abstract. For this demonstration, I chose a flower-like image with some vines and leaf shapes. I will also put a border around the design. Once the wax design has been applied, it is recommended that the wax dry for 4 to 6 hours or even overnight. It is possible to attempt to do the water etching prior to that, for example, once the wax looks dry. However, there is the risk that it isn't totally dry, although it appears to be, and then when rubbing with the sponge and water, some of the wax may be removed and the design altered. So best to be on the safe side and wait. I will be applying the wax resist on a bone dry piece of clay. I've gone ahead and drawn out the border as I mentioned before, and I will be freehand drawing the design with the wax resist. Once the wax resist is on, it's really difficult to remove. So if you feel that you may go outside the lines or have problems with the application, you may want to consider drawing out your design and then following it along in wax, similar to what I've done with the border here. I will be using my synthetic brush, and primarily I'll be using a flat brush, a round brush, and a liner brush. And I do have another video on the different brush shapes and brush strokes and which is appropriate, which brush might be appropriate for a particular stroke or application. So if you'd like to view that, you may find that helpful. For now, I'm going to apply wax on the border, and something to know is that if you feel more comfortable going from left to right or up and down, or I should say horizontal to vertical lines, then instead of just drawing out your box like this or your border, just go ahead and move the tile so that you're moving in a direction that you feel comfortable with for the application of the wax. So I actually feel for this particular tile that I want to be applying the wax at an angle. So I've gone ahead and loaded up my brush with wax. And I'm using this flat brush, and I'm using the edge of the flat brush along the line that I have drawn. So I'll have to give it a couple of coats here. Turn my brush. I do find that I have to reload my brush with wax along the way on a dry piece of clay than I do when I'm working on a leather hard piece of clay. As the wax dries, it will darken in color. In any case, once I put my design, I will be giving it a second coat, and we'll see that the color will actually darken even more. If we can see here where it's thick, you see that it's much darker color than it is right here where there's a lighter application. So in some ways that's very helpful because it lets you know where you might want to apply additional wax in your design. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the sketch that I had drawn for my design for my tile as a reference. And I will begin to draw that design in wax in the center of the tile. So the design I've chosen does have thin lines. Again, I'll be going over them more than once. You do not need to choose a design that's as detailed, and the lines for your design may be thicker than what I am demonstrating here. And as you see where the application was a little bit thinner, it's already starting to dry, and just go ahead and go over that right now, although I will go over the entire design with wax. So now that I've laid out the design and I already have an idea of what areas will be recessed and which areas will be raised, in order for this to balance, I'm going to go ahead and fill in these leaf forms so that they become solid. So some of the areas that may appear a little thin, I'll probably go back over them. And another thing I will do that I usually do in any drawing or any type of surface treatment that I do is I make sure that I clearly define where lines end and where lines meet. So anywhere two lines meet or intersect and where the lines end, I want those clearly defined. Okay, so I've had a chance to go over all the lines and details, and now the next step is to wait for the wax to dry, and then proceed with the following step in the process. So it's been about 24 hours since I applied the wax and it dried. Again, depending on the manufacturer, some recommend 4 to 6 hours, some recommend overnight, some claim the wax dries very quickly, but that's kind of subjective. What does quickly mean? 15 minutes, half hour. I tend to be on the conservative side, and so there's no harm in waiting. So I just decided to wait before I began the water etching process. I'm just going to take my sponge, dip it into the water. I don't want it to be wet because I don't want to saturate the bone dry piece. And I'll just begin by simply going over the tile. I will continue to go back and forth until I start to see that the background starts to appear a little recessed. I'm not being very aggressive in how I'm rubbing the tile. It's nice to see that even though I'm going back and forth with water on this tile, that even the areas that had fine lines and appeared a little thinner are still holding up really well. The wax has not eroded away. So I'll just continue to do this. And I actually do start to feel a difference from where the wax design is and the background. So I would say this is a good place to stop. I can see and feel a difference between the raised wax area and the recessed area. I would say another important thing to remember is to keep your sponge and your water clean. This would be a good time for me to change out the water if I was going to continue. You don't want to have the slurry and the sand and grog, depending on the type of clay you're using. It might have a lot of sand and grog, and then you're taking that and scraping over the wax. And I think even if you're working with something like porcelain or slip cast piece that might not have that sand and grog situation, you're still dragging slurry across the surface. And it's just a lot nicer to keep your water and your sponge clean as you're doing the water etching. So the next thing after this, I would let it dry and then fire it to bisque temperature, and then next step is glaze selection. And most often in this situation, you would probably want to select a translucent type glaze that would really showcase the raised surface texture on the piece. So for now, I'm pretty happy with the end result. And of course, once we see the final result with glaze, it will tell us even more about this particular piece.